សូមជើញអង្គុយ
President, please be seated. Mr. Co-Prosecutor, you may now resume your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We saw at the beginning of the hearing the statement attributed to Nguyen Xia in the book by Tet Sambat on the forced nature of marriages. This forced nature of marriages in general can also be deduced by the words of Ieng Sary just after the regime in December 1980. In an interview, Ieng Sary explains that beginning in 1980 or maybe 1979, certain freedoms were given back to people under the control of the Khmer Rouge, specifically the right to get married freely or the right of families to live together, which was a contrast to what had been before. This is document E3/681. It's a statement by Ieng Sary in the New York Times in an article written by Henry Kam and titled in English, Pol Pot Aid Calls for World Support. It's dated December 1st, 1980. In Khmer, it is on page 00651246. In French, 00630693 and 94. And in English, 001229194. And I quote, "The Deputy Prime Minister set out in detail the new program embraced by his colleagues. Mr. Ieng Sary explained that all political parties would now be admitted. And Mr. Ieng Sary then continues, "We will authorize freedom of religion and education. Marriages would be free and families will be able to live together." And a bit further, the article continues. He added, "There will be free cooperatives. They won't be obligatory as before, and we will establish collaborations with foreign societies. After all, we are an underdeveloped country." End of the Ieng Sary quote, and the article continues. Asked about the reason for the complete revision of the measures of the Pol Pot government when he was in power, a period of 4 years during which thousands of Cambodians perished or were assassinated, who died from hunger or illnesses for lack of treatment, the Deputy Prime Minister responded, open quote, "We started the revolution. Many errors were also committed during the Vietnamese and French revolutions. There were many good things, and there were also many mistakes. We tried." End quote. Invited to list the good things accomplished during the revolution, Mr. Ieng Sary hesitated, and he asked a colleague, Chun Chun, Minister of Economy and Finance, to respond. End of the citation of this E3/681. The issue of marriage, in addition to population growth, was specifically important under democratic Kampuchea, up to the point where zone secretaries had to report the number of marriages that occurred each month. At least, and that's what we see in the following document, E3/1094. It's a monthly report of July 1978, addressed on 4 August 1978 by Office M401. In from the West Zone, I believe, and sent to Ankara, well-respected and well-loved Ankara. And at the very end of this report, there is a table. In English, it is on page 00315383. In French, 00593538. And in Khmer, 00143617. The table is entitled The Number of Births and Deaths and Marriage. And it indicates the region is 32. Number of births is 185, and the number of deaths 121, and marriages 42 couples. There's another document which certainly served in order to put together this report from July 1978. The document is E3/1092. It's a report of Office M401 to Ankara, dated 16 July 1978. And this is in fact one of the 3 reports which were sent every 10 days to Ankara for the month of July 1978. On English, page 00289924. In French, 00611450. In Khmer, 00143579. We see the following note under the title, Living Conditions of the Population. And I quote, "On the founding of families, we married 10 couples in District 26 and Region 32. And in Region 31 and Region 37, we have not yet received a report on this topic." End quotation. And I'd like to come back to document E3/1094, this monthly report of July 1978, which was sent by the office M401 to Ankara, because it points out another problem. And this is something that the civil parties and the witnesses have often talked about. This is the suicide of people who had recently been married. Nevertheless, the report does not dare to conclude that these people committed suicide specifically because of the marriage itself. But let's see what the report says. On English, page 00315373. In French, 00593529. And in Khmer, 00143609. This section of the report talks about the situation of national defense in Sector 32, and in particular, the activities of internal enemies. And this is what it says under the title, Acts of Suicide by Hanging. And I quote, "In District 27 in the Teng Crouch Cooperative, one man named Ol had previously lived in a mobile unit of the region. After his arranged marriage, arranged by Ankara, he was demobilized in order to come back and live in the cooperative. 15 days later, it was the 26th of July 1978, he hung himself. We considered the causes, but there was nothing in the past period which could have explained the phenomenon." End quote. Now we'll come back to the marriage itself and the concept of the revolutionary family. And first of all, with an analytical report presented to the United Nations in January 1979. The source of this report are witness statements of Cambodian refugees who had fled the regime. The report is in document E3/2060. And I will say the title in English. I'd also quote in English.
Analytical report by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights entitled Analysis prepared on behalf of the Subcommission by its Chairman of Materials, dated 30th of January 79. At page in English 00078662, in French 00292906, and in Khmer 00294968. It's about Article 16, which concerns the right to marry, the free and full consent of the intending spouses, the entitlement of the family unit to protection by society and the state. I quote, "It is alleged that the right to marry has been seriously infringed, and several refugees have claimed that prior to 1976, marriages were entirely prohibited in the communities where they lived. Specific violations of this article, to which references in the materials are most frequent, relate to the strict prohibition of courting, the need to apply for permission to marry, the arbitrary handling of such applications, and the infringement of the right of free choice on the part of females, particularly in cases where local officials or members of the Khmer Rouge wish to marry them. The separations arising from the establishment of workforces according to sex and age in certain parts of the country, and the practice of separating children from their parents is also cited in some refugee accounts as an infringement of the right of the family to protection by the state." End of quote in English.
Next, I would like to read a few excerpts of the book by the expert Elizabeth Becker, When the War Was Over, Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge Revolution. I've already read an excerpt from this book at the beginning of this presentation. Numbers are E3/20 and E3/9365. First of all, Becker points out the contradictions of this marriage policy, and also the fact that in contrast to the statements of the Khmer Rouge leaders, including Pol Pot and Nuon Chea, as we've seen, so in contrast to these affirmations, the birth rate dropped dramatically under the regime. So the quotation in English, I'll continue in English.
C'est à la page en
It's on English page 00237929. In French 00638486. And in Khmer, it's probably on page 00232298.
So I quote in English. Like other authoritarian societies bent on becoming wealthy overnight, the Khmer Rouge were schizophrenic about sex and procreation. On the one hand, they thought sex should be restricted because it took up too much time and detracted from the cause at hand, overnight industrialization and glorification of the motherland. Yet, they also decided there should be many more Cambodians to carry out this program and ordered that the population double. The solution was no sex, no romance, but regular visitation rights for husband and wife. In fact, the Khmer Rouge did become so sexually repressive that sadism affected much of cooperative life. The date for marriage was moved up to 22 years of age for men, 20 years for women, a rule originally adopted for the army alone. Any sex before marriage was punishable by death in many cooperatives and zones. Young people were segregated by sex and expected to work, learn utter devotion to Ankar, and forget about the opposite sex. Predictably, the birth rate dropped dramatically. Many women stopped menstruating entirely, partly because of malnutrition, partly because of the trauma. End of quote. Et je reprends en français.
And I will now speak in French again. Elizabeth Becker then confirms the need for approval of each marriage by the heads of the cooperatives. It's on page 257 in English, or ERN 00237962. In French, 00638517, and in Khmer, 00232339. And I quote in English.
In democratic Cambodia, a couple could marry only with the approval of the cooperative elders. In practice, that meant marriages were generally arranged by the party. The Puritanism of the regime restricted many newlyweds from living together and provided for conjugal visits a few times a month when the wife believed herself fertile. End of quote.
Finally, Becker also speaks of defrocked monks who were called to be married. In fact, as we saw at the beginning, in the book of Tet Sambat, it was explained that many men were killed in the war between 1970 and 1975, and certainly that is where the need to also marry former monks came from. This is what Becker says on page 254 in English, ERN 002329, rather. Co-prosecutor begins again, 00237959, in French 00638514, and in Khmer 00232336. I quote in English still.
Those who were not executed were ordered to forfeit their robes and join the people to work in the cooperatives as common field hands, an order that violated their religious tenets. Those who refused were killed. Many monks were ordered to marry, which prevented them from returning to the clergy. End of quote.
Ian Harris also mentions this issue of marrying de facto monks in his book, which has two document numbers, E3/2818 and E3/6938. The title of this book is Buddhism under Pol Pot. And we find this in English page 00703990 and 91. In French, 0083, 63, 78, and 79. And Khmer, 0079, 13, 04, and 05. Once again, I will be quoting in English. That's for the interpreters.
So the title of the excerpt is called Forced Marriage of Monks. And I quote, "Reports that monks, either individually or sometimes en masse, were coerced into taking partners are extraordinarily frequent, and the practice may have been more widespread than evidence suggests. The reason for this is that many monks who rejoined the monastic order in the PRK period were reluctant to admit to any diminution of celibacy during the Democratic Kampuchea period, on the grounds that such a revelation would simultaneously impact on their spiritual prestige and future career prospects within the Sangha." And then further down, the proportion of monks who were forced to marry could be quite high. Of the 68 monks residing at Wat Chum Nik before April 1975, for example, 40, which is 58.8%, ended up in forced marriages. One informant from Wat Poti Rengsei claimed that most of the pagoda's pre-75 monks got married, and that this was the reason that so few of the surviving contingent of the village's ex-monks reordained after 1979. End of quote.
Concerning the de facto monks, still, there was a will to force them to marriage, and a particularly interesting witness statement from someone who did not end up getting married is that of Tep Vong in document E3/7906. It is dated 19 January 1986. So the excerpt in question is quite long. In French, it is on page 008576262228. In English, 00711584 And in Khmer, 0085068992. At the beginning of the interview, there is an indication that the interview took place at Wat Uналом, and that Tep Vong was in charge of Buddhism and religion, Vice President of Reconstruction and National Defense of the People, Vice President of the National Assembly, Representative of Kampuchea to the ABCP, the Asian Buddhist Conference for Peace. And I quote what Tep Vong says at the ERNs that I named above. And just to orient you regarding this excerpt. He's talking about Chi Krang district in the Siem Reap province in the North Zone. And I quote, "I stayed until the month of November, 1975, at which point I had to defrock. During the 6 months that I remained a monk, I had to work every day. I had to carry out all sorts of agricultural tasks, to carry out labor and transplantation while remaining independent and self-sufficient, because no one was able to bring me anything to eat. 15 of these 60 monks who left Wat Rijbo with me went to Wat Kabal Damre. The others had left their robes one after the other when they learned clearly from the propaganda that Buddhism would not last for a long time. In mid-October, they made a statement saying that the organization would no longer authorize religion and that there would be no more monks." And a bit further down, several days later, a second delegation arrived with weapons in order to ask me to defrock. The next morning, I left my monk's robes on November 14, 1975. I knew that I would be killed if I continued to resist. After having left my robes behind, I asked to be able to come back to my village of Trapang Chok, the Siem Reap district, where I worked with my family on repairing carts for horses and cattle. 1 month later, they asked me to get married. I refused, and they sent me to a work group in order to carry out agricultural works. I stayed there 1 month. A member of the village committee then asked me to come back to build a barn for rice, because he knew that I was a carpenter. Towards August or September 1976, I was arrested in the middle of the night. They beat me until I lost consciousness. I came to the next morning. They had punished me for 2 reasons. First, for having refused to get married, and then for having shaved my head every 2 weeks and continued to pray to Buddha in secret. They must have discovered this. They asked me several questions. Why had I not gotten married? Why was I shaving my head? And then he describes his arrival at the security center in Siem Reap, the KROUS Security Center. And I quote, "This was a district security center, but it was located in the city of Siem Reap. They questioned me mainly on the reasons why I did not want to marry and why I was shaving my head. I answered that no woman would be able to love me, and they said that this was of no importance." And then he says, "I survived thanks to my skills." The fact that he could make wheels and carts. And then he says, "Fortunately, the head of the village died, and they freed me after 84 days in this place." End quote. Another author, because we spoke of Becker and Harris and others, another author, Raoul Marc Jannar, analyzed marriages under democratic Kampuchea, and he connects forced marriages with the disappearance of private life, as well as the total ownership of individuals by the Communist Party of Kampuchea. It's book E3/3993. It is entitled Kyo Sampan and the Khmer Rouge. In French, the page is 00751347. In English, 00922106 and 07. And in Khmer, 00923051. And then we'll see later 53 and 54. The first excerpt relating to forced marriage. This is what Ro Mark Janar says. Under the Democratic Kampuchea regime, the Communist Party of Kampuchea took upon itself to own the lives of the men and women of the country. All individual freedoms were banned. Any form of private life was forbidden. The CPK expected to decide the fate of each and every human being. This will of total ownership of individuals by the party was translated specifically into forced marriages. Democratic Kampuchea instituted the privilege for authorities of the people's communes or the village chiefs to proceed to have authority completely arbitrarily over marriages and without the consent of the future spouses, and in most of the cases noted, without the future spouses even knowing each other before their day of marriage. Any form of private life was banned. Marriage could only be a collective act under the authority of Ankara. Any other form of marriage was considered by the regime as a moral offense, which could be punished by sanctions up to and including the death penalty. To refuse could lead to rape, torture, imprisonment, and even death. In the same way that refusing to consummate the imposed marriage could. Ankara also accorded to disabled military the right to take a wife of their choice, whether the wife consented or not. And a bit later, on page 00751349, in French, 009221107 in English, and in Khmer, 00923053 and 54.
Il dit ceci.
It reads as follows, and I quote, "This practice, that is a practice of forced marriage, meant for most of the persons concerned legalized rape. Many women committed suicide. For almost all the others, they suffered deep traumas. The expression of total contempt for the dignity of persons and marriages imposed by the CPK was known by Khieu Samphan. Not only did the CPK publications refer to that, but he himself praised it to King Norodom Sihanouk in April 1976, as related in 167. According to Khieu Samphan, young women accepted through their marriage to take care of the well-being of heroes who had sacrificed themselves in the interest of the national salvation. Regarding late Norodom Sihanouk, let's see what he wrote exactly regarding Khieu Samphan's knowledge of forced marriages and his document E3/2813, book by Norodom Sihanouk entitled Prisoner of the Khmer Rouge, And the page in Khmer is 0063284344. In English, 00632939. And in French, 00395353. And I quote, I can look at Kyo Sampan, the companion of my trips through the provinces. I had succeeded through some verbal tricks to obtain from him impressive confessions. And a bit later on, now we talk about what he considered as his initial confessions, and Norodom Sihanouk continues as follows. With the same innocence, it is the avowal of forced marriages. And in parentheses, Kyo Sampan says, not forced. Young girls driven from Phnom Penh and other towns in April 1975 were forcibly married to Khmer Rouge heroes, people who were mutilated. Yes, those who were injured were handicapped, one-eyed persons, blind persons, people who had only one arm or one leg, or who were completely legless. Kyo Sampan may well have asserted that these young ladies possessed, in parentheses, heightened patriotic spirit and accepted through their marriages to take care of the well-being of the heroes who had sacrificed themselves for national salvation. My wife and I trembled with horror at the idea of such marriages. The Frankenstein of the films of horror could not have imagined such monstrosity. Certainly, the authentic heroes, who were physically very diminished, deserved all our respect and all our compassion. But to accept the gaiety of heart, the idea of sacrificing gentle virgins who had just left college, secondary schools and universities, on the altar of such a form of patriotism, there is a gap that our spirit cannot fill. Let us now look at what some witnesses and several parties said. We have the record of interview E3/9820. It's a witness called Prep Sokhon, PREAPSOKHOEURN. He was aged 24 in 1975 and lived in the village of Andong Tapik in the commune of Tumapun, district of Prechor, Kampuncham province, and worked as a team leader in a team of 12 in a cotton plantation in that commune of Tumapun. And I'll read at length this record of interview because it speaks volumes. There is no E and N because the questions and answers are numbered. I start with question number 12, which was put to the witness. Did you remain in that cotton plantation up until the arrival of the Vietnamese troops in Cambodia? Answer: in 1977, the Khmer Rouge celebrated marriages. They forced me to marry a handicapped man I didn't love. I refused to obey and I was sent for re-education. They told me that if I did not accept to marry as ordered by Ankara, I would be executed. That story got as far as my father, who recommended that I should get married to avoid being killed. This situation was indeed very turbulent. Question 13. Did the marriage take place in the cotton plantation? Answer, yes. One day, a messenger came to summon me to an interview with the chief of a mobile company, Neely, who was, by the way, a woman. When I arrived, she asked me whether I accepted to obey Ankara, and I responded that I was the property of Ankara. Consequently, I had to obey. If Ankara told me to get married, I had to get married. Then Miss Lee told me to go back home. The following day, it was announced on the loudspeaker at 3 a.m. that we had to go and work up to 5:30. At 6:30, a messenger came to ask me why I was still working, whereas I was supposed to get married on that same day. I did not know anything about that program.
Entre la plantation et le village.
I was completely dumbfounded. During the trip to the village, when I arrived, Neely questioned me to know why I was weeping, and I explained that it was because the marriage was not being celebrated according to the Khmer traditions, and that my parents were absent. Neely didn't say anything. All she did was to spread out to me the new clothes and a krama. Question 20 regarding marriages. Did you think you had a choice? Answer, if I had had a choice, I would have refused to get married, but I did not have the choice. We were not free to question their orders. An example, at Chamka Kaba, we had to do all the work they ordered us to do. Then I had to marry upon the instructions given my husband, whom I hadn't seen, I'd never seen before. Question 21. In your opinion, what would have happened to you if you had refused to get married? Answer 21. Before I got married, they arrested those who refused to submit to such marriages and who fled, and they then executed them. I saw a girl become a victim of this tragedy. Her name was Peng. She objected to a marriage and fled from the cooperative to join the cooperative. Then the union went to arrest her for disobedience to Ankara's discipline. She was not attached at the time, she was not tied up at the time of her arrest. But later on, they tied her up and tied her to a cart. Prung disappeared, and I saw with my own eyes her arrest. It was the militia or the security guards who took her out of the cooperative. Witnessing the arrest and the execution terrified me. Question 22, what would you have liked to see in terms of your marriage? Answer 22, I would have liked my parents to participate in the choice of my spouse and in the organization of my marriage. I didn't want to marry a handicapped person, and my parents did not have the right to choose my spouse for me or to organize the ceremonies. The Khmer Rouge married, therefore, 40 or 50 couples at a time in the absence of the parents, but chose in the unit 2 persons who were supposed to represent the parents. Question 23. But who took the decision to pair up the future spouses? Answer 22. The head of the cooperative, called So, married people up. But I didn't know if he was aware, he was the one who took the initiative to marry the people up. If he had received orders from the upper echelon. Question number 24. Why were you forced to marry a handicapped person? Answer number 24. They said that those handicapped persons had made sacrifices on the battlefield and had to be compensated by being given a wife. Question 24. How many couples had to get married at the same time with you? Answer: 15 couples had to get married on that day. Question 26. But who had to be married with you? Example: did the new inhabitants, were the new inhabitants able to marry the old persons, chums with Chinese? Answer: there was the case of a couple in which the woman was Chinese. She was called Red, and the man was a chum whose name was San. After the process, they did not consummate the marriage. In fact, Red had rejected San because he was circumcised. Both accepted to live together in order not to reveal the problem to the community. I learned of it from Red herself. I saw her for the last time in 1979. Question: why did they have to hide the fact of not having consummated the marriage? Number 27. In that context, Anka executed any spouses without seeking to know what the problem was. I learned from the Khmer Rouge. I learned that the Khmer Rouge took such a measure because it had happened to a couple who had refused to consummate the marriage. In fact, the couple was executed. It was a story that terrified us. Many couples were killed for that reason in the union. Rin, for instance, one day disappeared from the unit. I put the question to Nilif to know where Rin was. Question 30. Why did they? Question 31. Why did they impose a marriage? Answer: before instituting this process, So had announced during meetings that Anka needed additional manpower. Consequently, they had to marry young boys and girls, so young men and women, in order for them to serve the revolution and to make children. Question 32. Were these marriages frequent? Answer: there were many marriages. I recall that they were organized in 1976, 1977, 1978, and involved for the first time 50 couples, the second time 40 couples, and the third time 20 couples. Ultimately, there were 15 couples on the occasion of my marriage. We talked about, we heard of these marriages that took place in the union, but we were not allowed to attend them. Question 34, why did they marry some and not others? Answer, they married as a matter of priority the oldest persons in the units. And later down the text, Lee in person during daily meetings asked us who wanted to get married, but none of the girls would answer in the affirmative. Consequently, Lee suggested so that he chose the oldest girls in the unit and to marry them up. We were lost because we did not know what was going to happen to us. The youths who had to be married were not informed in advance, and they did not know up to the day they had to be married. At times, it happened that they did not find any persons to place on lists. They therefore took other girls to replace them. Some boys were in love and had to be married to the girls they loved. When the head of the unit refused to marry those who were, to pair up those who were in love, they protested. Unfortunately, they arrested those who challenged the instructions and took them away. I heard my work colleagues talk about this case. There's another example, that of Eun and Mun. Mun did not love Min because he was too fat. Eun disappeared because he disobeyed instructions. I heard this when I met Min, and he told me that he hadn't reported the problem to Anka, and so on and so forth. And then have question number 36, which talks about the wedding night. Where did you sleep on that night? Answer, at 19 hours, So sent his messenger to fetch me, to tell me that I had to sleep with my husband. When I protested, So threatened me, saying, haven't you seen that those who oppose the instructions disappear? I therefore went to spend the night in that hut with my husband. They left us together for 3 nights, but I didn't sleep with my husband. I didn't feel like it. But he wanted us to make love, and he asked me why I refused. Question, when did you accept to consummate your marriage? Answer, I did not sleep with him for 4 nights, but I subsequently did so. Every month, he came to see me, and he wanted to also make love. Once, I bit his wrist because I did not want to touch him. The head of the mechanics unit noticed the scar and asked me some questions. Question 39. They did refuse to consummate the marriage because during the 4 months, but did you have any problems with the militias? Answer 39, no, because the militia were not aware of what had happened. However, once, So questioned me to find out why I refused to sleep with my husband. I answered that I slept all the nights with my husband. Apparently, he believed me, but he nevertheless reminded me that I had to obey Anchor. Answer 43. The following day in the morning, on a bicycle. He came on a bicycle to take down Day, to take me to my husband. After raping me, he apologized and said that he was only following Ankar's orders. He again told me the following: according to Khmer traditions, you must always sleep together after marriage. Question 45. Did they spy on you during that episode? Answer: yes, the militias were present. That house had a door in the front and another behind. At a point in time, I wanted to jump out of the house, but my husband told me that there were people who are stationed there and that they will catch me. On question number 46, was that the only time when your husband raped you? Answer: after that initial incident, I no longer opposed his advances, although I never felt any desire to sleep with him. Question number 48. Did your husband tell you that he had acted on the orders of Ankar, but do you think that that was true? Answer: knowing his character, I do not believe that he lied. If he had really wanted to rape me, he would have done it from the very beginning, immediately after our marriage. He explained to me that he felt pity for me because I was small, but he was obliged to do it because he was following Ankar's orders. Questions: what did you feel when you learned that he had to marry you? What did you feel when you saw him for the first time? Answer: I did not even look at him because I was terribly depressed. I lowered my head because my leg was twisted. I was completely devastated. To complete, Mr. President, I would like to present a last document. What happened to young men who are not handicapped soldiers? The initiative was taken to make a proposal of marriage to his chief with a view to improving his living conditions. We're going to talk about E3/9000, a book by Duong Savon titled The Mystery of Sexual Violence Under the Khmer Rouge Regime. And I'll quote it in English solely because there is no French translation, no Khmer translation of the document, and it is on page 00992194. That is on page 18 of the book.
That page says the following: about a person named Mia Kim Chorn, alias Kru Ling. And on the top of the page there's a short biography of that person, and it says, quote, "Today he lives in Pinglva Commune, Udong District, Kampong Speu Province, and works as the director of Stra Kleng Primary School. He was married the second time in 1979. Before the Khmer Rouge regime, he was a monk in Unalom Pagoda in Phnom Penh until 1975. And then follows the story of Mr. Hu Ling, and I quote, Mr. Ling lived in Small Puk district, Battambang province. He dug earth to transplant rice, worked in rice fields, dug canals, and did other work. In June 1978, when he was 26 years old, he was married among 56 couples. A 21-year-old widow requested to marry him. She was the one who requested the marriage to the cooperative chief, and the head of his unit told him about this. He did not love this woman, but they came to convince him, so that he eventually agreed. He said this woman did not really love him either. As far as he knew, she had 3 reasons. The first was to avoid further observation and suspicion against her because her first husband was accused of betraying Ankar. Secondly, once married, she could come back to stay in the village with her parents. The third reason was that family of the woman was aristocratic during the previous period. They were rich and they had a very high education, which stood in contrast to him and his whole family. With regard to their life together, from the outside, it looked like husband and wife, but in fact it was not. Mr. Ling said this marriage was sure to be separated one day, because each of them had the belief that they were not really husband and wife for the future. As he imagined, after the Liberation Day in 1979, he decided in March to immediately leave his wife, who he was married to during the Khmer Rouge regime. End of quote. And then there's just the last passage where it explains why Miss Mi Kim Chon alias Hu Ling wants to testify to the young generation. And it says the following, I quote, "He is telling the story for the general population to understand that husband and wife cannot be married by force like cows and water buffaloes. Humans have hearts and need to think about the future. Otherwise, they will face many different problems, violence, no prosperity, and end with divorce." End of quote. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Co-Prosecutor. It is now convenient time for our lunch break. We take a break now and resume at 1:30 this afternoon so that we can continue our proceeding. Security personnel, you are instructed to take Kiew Sampon to the waiting room downstairs and have him return to attend the proceedings this afternoon. Before 1:30, the court is now in recess.